On Thursday, September 25th, 2025, the president of Ghana, John Dramani Mahama, gave a powerful speech at the UN General Assembly where he basically called the United Nations a toothless bulldog. Of course, that's not how he said it, but he used a lot of diplomatic words which I interpreted to mean that is what he said. So, what did Mahama say and what was the context of what he said? That's going to be the conversation of this video where I'm going to focus on an aspect of his speech. In subsequent videos, I'm going to talk about different aspects of his speech. So, if intellectual conversations is something you are into, subscribe to this channel. Right, let's get right into it. So, if you are somebody who is into international relations and foreign policy like I am, you know that in 2009, Muammar Gaddafi, the then president of Libya, spoke for 90 minutes at the United Nations General Assembly, even though he was offered just 15 minutes, 15. And when he spoke, he ended his speech by tearing the UN Charter because in his estimation, the UN was not living up to the ideals of his charter. And it's almost 20 years since then. And the United Nations is still not living up to the ideals of the UN Charter. Basically, that is what Mahama was saying. Mahama was saying that under the UN Charter Article 2.1, it is enshrined in there that every country have equal sovereignty under the UN. But the UN is treating some countries like they are Tony Montana. The world is yours. You know that quote from Tony Montana, the Scarface movie. And so some countries are out here working like they are more important than other countries. And it is hard time that came to an end. That is what Mahama said. And he used several scenarios to illustrate the point. But one scenario really caught my attention because it is the most important or most relevant issue happening in the world right now. So Mahama started by saying a quote from Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, who Mahama referred to as our nation's founder. Go him. And he said, Kwame Nkrumah said, "We seek to be friends with all and enemies to none." So what that means is that Ghana is a proud member of the non-aligned movement. And usually, when people hear that Ghana is non-aligned movement, they think that that means that Ghana is passive and then we don't take positions on international issues. But that's not what non-aligned movement means. Non-aligned movement means that Ghana take positions on issues based on what we believe to be the right issue and not based on the parties involved in the issue. So, like NATO is a movement. Members of NATO, if a NATO country like maybe France have an issue with a non-NATO country like Russia, the US, another NATO country, will take the side of France no matter what the issue is. Ghana doesn't do that. If France and Russia have an issue, Ghana will sit down, analyze the issue and say, France, you are right. Russia, you are wrong. That's what non-aligned movement means, for those who didn't know what that meant. And Mahama brought this up and related it to the ongoing war in Gaza. And there are aspects of the ongoing war in Gaza that Mahama highlighted that I was proud of. So, for example, Mahama said that Ghana recognized the Palestinian state in 1988. Why is this relevant today? Countries like the United Kingdom and France are finally recognizing the Palestinian state and calling for two-state solution in 2025. So Ghana was 30 years ahead of the rest of the world. That's what Mahama essentially said. But you know, as Mahama is a very diplomatic gentleman, so he didn't use the fiery language somebody like me, if I was the president of Ghana, would use. So he said it nicely that you people are doing in 2025 something Ghana did in 1988. And he also said, he didn't say this, but it's important that he linked this to we being friends with everybody. The year Ghana recognized Palestine as a country was the same year Israel built their embassy in Ghana. So Ghana, but even though we recognize the Palestinian state, did not cut diplomatic relations with Israel, because Ghana have had a relationship with Israel going all the way to 1957. Actually, the first trainer of the Ghana Air Force was an Israeli Air Force person. So Ghana has a long-standing relationship with Israel, and recognizing the Palestinian state did not interfere with our relationship with Israel. It's even strengthened our relationship with Israel to the point that at some point Israel was an observing member of ECOWAS. ECOWAS is Economic Community of West African States. Israel is nowhere close to West Africa, but we recognize Israel as an observing member of the ECOWAS because of the relationship some ECOWAS countries have with them. So I think what Mahama was reiterating is that you can do the right thing in the Gaza war without having to butcher your relationship with Israel, if that's what you're concerned about. He didn't use those words, but that's what I inferred from his statement. And then he went on to say that the presidents of the US and the United States have set a bad precedent by denying President Abbas of the Palestinian state visa to attend the UN General Assembly. And I believe that that is the most powerful thing President Mahama said. Why is this the most powerful thing he said? I'll tell you why. So Mahama went through some history around the founding of the US. This was something he left out, but I'm bringing it up because it's in a subtext. When the UN was set up in 1947, the United Nations entered an agreement with the United States country. And that agreement was known as the UN Headquarters Agreement. And that agreement was saying that the United Nations will establish their headquarters in Manhattan, New York. And the establishment of the UN headquarters in New York will give the UN legal status in New York. So if you have like an embassy in the US, your embassy has a legal status where the US cannot just barge into your embassy. So the UN headquarters in New York has that immunity. But even more bigger than that, as under the UN headquarters agreement, the US will grant access to all UN member states and their representative if they are coming to the US for UN business. So if a country who the US have issues with wants to come to the UN for their country business, the US is under obligation to grant that country or their representative access to their business in the UN. And they would be provided with security exceptions. Say, for example, you are a country who have issues with the US, and maybe your president is a wanted man in the US. The UN, under this headquarters, what's the name, assembly rule or agreement, the US cannot arrest you while you are in the US for UN business. They can arrest you at some other time. But while you're in the US for UN business, they can arrest you. So this is an agreement the US signed in 1947. And actually, the US has obeyed this agreement all these years. So I'll give you an example. The US and Iran has a long-standing beef. The US does not have diplomatic relationship with Iran from, I think, 1979, I believe. And from 1979, all leaders of Iran and their representative have been granted access to attend UN meeting in the US because headquarters agreement. So in 1960, the US put an embargo on Cuba. And the same 1960, Fidel Castro, the president of Cuba, attended the UN General Assembly and spoke for 3 hours calling out the US. And he had a liberty to do that because headquarters agreement. Even Venezuela, the US does not recognize Maduro, the president of Venezuela, as the real president of Venezuela. But Maduro have attended UN meetings in the US since, I think in 2018 he did, and 2023 he also did. In 2018, Trump was the president, he did. 2023, Biden was the president, he did. This is important because that will mean that by denying the Palestinian president access to the UN General Assembly, the US is involved in unprecedented business. The US is going towards an uncharted ground. And President Mahama linked this to the fact that when the UN was established, not every country in the world was free. African countries were being spoken for on the UN stages by our colonial masters. And in 2025, it still feels like our colonial masters are speaking for us. And some countries are given preferential treatment than others. So the US, even though it is the headquarters of the UN, is not supposed to have more preferential treatment than, what's the name, the Palestinian states, because they are all member states of the UN, right? And so Mahama is saying that by allowing countries like the US to move the way they are moving, the UN is being toothless. The UN is powerless. The UN Charter is outdated. That's what Mahama essentially said. And unlike Muammar Gaddafi, he didn't tear up the UN Charter, but he used diplomatic language to communicate that the UN needs to sit up. And I was excited to hear that once again, a president of Ghana went to the world stage and represented the interests of our country the right way. Presidents of Ghana, including Nana Akufo-Addo, President Rawlings, President Kufuor, I'm mentioning recent presidents, have gone to the UN and made statements that are powerful. Ghana is a very respected country on the international stage, and anytime the presidents of Ghana have spoken on these platforms, they have carried themselves with the respect that our country deserves to be accorded on the world stage. I wanted to just highlight this aspect of Mahama's speech, and moving forward, I think on Monday, I'm going to post another video where we will focus on Mahama supporting William Ruto's call for an Africa to have permanent seat on the UN Security Council, what that means and how that will look like. That will be what we'll talk about on Monday. So on Monday, we'll talk about a different aspect of Mahama's speech related to the speech by the president of Kenya. And actually, I'm going to bring in the speech by Trump, President Macron of France, and the Prime Minister of Japan, because it looks like nobody likes the UN. Everybody hates the UN right now. And so subscribe to this channel if you want to be alerted when I post that video on Monday.